Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Pere Almeda, Director of the Center for Contemporary Studies, an in-house think tank of the Catalan government devoted to analyze the main global challenges that our society faces. This afternoon, together with the Office for Civil Rights and Political Rights, we are holding the debate National Populism and the Media, the cases of Turkey, the United States, and Hungary. This webinar discussion is part of the activities that we are organizing that are related to the special issue of ideas on democracy and civil rights in the world. This special issue is focused on the threats to liberal democracies in a context of declining democracies around the world, as many indicators are showing us. In the light of recent events, the US election, the victory of President Biden, the accusations of electoral fraud by Donald Trump, and the radical protesters storming the Capitol, there are who might say that all these episodes could be seen as a turning or a shifting point on the growing influence of national populism on many countries. It's probably too soon to certify it, but what we know now is that the rise of authoritarianism, strongmen and national populist movements have affected the dynamics of democracy. They also have modified and polarized the public debate and have had a huge geopolitical impact around the globe. There are several causes for the mistrust and undermining of democracy. Growing inequalities that fracture our societies might be one of the main reasons. The concentration of all resources of power on a small technological and financial elites is also a plausible factor. But what is certain is that any explanation on today's world cannot be described simply. In a political reality of increasing complexity, what we require are in-depth analysis. But what we have instead is the spreading of simple messages, false rumors or fake news, or the proliferation of a hate speech against minorities or migrants looking for the perfect scapegoat. This explosive cocktail of national populist speech has used successfully the media and social networks to gain power and followers. They have changed the political agendas in a way that most of the time is almost impossible to accomplish a democratic dialogue. The use of media and social networks have had a tremendous impact on democratic deliberations in a way that remind us other obscure times of the past. To analyze this phenomenon, we have set and organized a comparative approach on the role of media in this growing influence of national populism. There are no easy answers, we know that. There are no easy answers on what to do or how to do it to stop the erosion of democratic legitimacy. But what I can surely say is that we are delighted to have the participation of great panelists and experts that join us this afternoon on this ideas debate. All of them have a long experience on studying national populism and media, and we are eager to listen to their fruitful thoughts and analysis to better understand the challenges ahead and to learn to do what it takes to make democracy prevail. Now I pass the floor to Adam Major, Head of the Office for Civil and Political Rights, who will be moderating today's debate. Adam?
Thank you, Pere. Gracias, Pere. First of all, let me say some words in Catalan, and then I came back to English quickly. Explicar que aquest debat d'avui és en anglès perquè els ponents parlen anglès i per tant ens ha semblat, no parlen ni català ni castellà, i ens ha semblat que era interessant portar-los i per tant s'havia de fer en anglès, però no obstant, si no us sentiu prou còmodes o o doncs, teniu dificultats per seguir el debat, sapigueu que se'n publicarem un resum a la pàgina de la revista Idees dedicada al monogràfic dedicat a la democràcia i a les seves amenaces i reptes del segle XXI, i publicarem un resum extens del debat d'avui en català. Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the second roundtable dedicated to the relationship between these kind of movements of right-wing movements or national populist movements with and the media. Yesterday we talked mainly about Catalonia and Spain, and today we want to focus on three cases that have maybe some or a lot in common. These are Hungary, Turkey, and United States, the USA, because there are three countries where this kind of national populist movements have raised power. And actually in Hungary and in Turkey, they are still there in power. So we would like to know how these movements behave with the media before and after they rise the power, how they use the media, the traditional media, the press, the newspaper, the radio, television, but also the what we call the new technologies, which are not very new. So how do they use the social media and everything that happens in internet? And to talk about that, we are very pleased, and it's an honor for us to have three panelists that I'm sure they will be very interesting. The first of them is Mr. Recep Tayyip, who is an associate professor at the College of Staten Island in New York, and who is the author of the book with a very suggestive name, Fox Populism, Branding Conservatism as Working Class. The second guest is Mr. Ece Temelkuran, who is a Turkish writer and journalist, who is also author of a highly recommended book. I had the chance to read it, and I really enjoy it in a way. This reading. The book is How to Lose a Country: The 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship. And the third speaker is Mr. Jordi Baquer. Hola, Jordi. He's the director for Global Foresight and Analysis at the Open Society Foundations. He's Catalan, as maybe you know, but he has following very close the situation in Hungary, and he will talk and he will explain us very well and deep about what is happening, what has happened in this country of Europe. Let's start the debate, and Mr. Peck is all yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this great panel and this great debate. I'll start off a little bit with first my argument about Fox News, which is arguably one of the most influential media organizations in American history. And my argument kind of breaks from the conventional take on Fox's appeal. So the conventional take on why Fox News has been so successful is its ideological slant, its conservative ideological orientation. But I argue, I present a different argument, right? I think that its style of presentation explains its power as much as its ideological bias. And I particularly zero in on the populist style that Fox News has cultivated in American journalism. And to really understand it, you have to dive deeper into American political history and also American media history. So I try to show the connecting points between these separate spheres of American life. So I want to start with the history of American populism, the political sphere. And so if you look at, I'll just stick to the 20th century. So in the early 20th century in the United States, particularly in the 1930s, it was the left, it was the Democratic left who most readily wielded populist rhetorical frames of being for the people and against elite. But in a leftist political imagination, these terms are mainly economic, right? So Democratic President Franklin Roosevelt talked about the economic royalists, the titans of industry, the monopoly powers, and the people. The other key, term in populism was mainly the industrial rank and file working class, unionized labor. But somewhere around the 1950s and 60s, you see this new breed of conservative populist politician, first with Joseph McCarthy, then with George Wallace. And really it was the Nixon administration that refined this conservative brand of populism and changed the whole script. And so rather than appealing to a kind of popular sense of class in terms of economics, conservatives started constructing class identity in the United States as a cultural identity and really exploited divisions based in taste and an education level and less to do with occupation or income level. And so it's the way in which, so I'm interested in the way in which conservatives have reconfigured the meaning of class, Americans' popular understanding of class using this rhetorical tradition of populism, right? Which is really a moral narrative. It's a moral discourse at its core. And so conservatives captured the populist style in the Nixon era and have used these narratives about the cultural elite, and they look down on you, and also, and there are economic and material conditions on the ground that help explain why this worked, right? For example, the explosion of higher education in the United States in the 1950s through the 1970s radically split the middle class between the college educated and the non-college educated. Other developments, the shift to a post-industrial economy where it matters more to have a college degree in the labor market, right, to succeed. And then, of course, the civil rights movement, right? So populism in the conservative imagination isn't just about elites above, but it's also about scapegoating particular groups below, right? Namely African Americans, immigrants, et cetera. And so the right wing has this kind of tripartite above, below, and then the people, which I could talk about left-wing populism later, how it's different. So that's the political history. But, this populist discourse on the right only had so much reach because the right wing in the United States hadn't conquered the media, right? And so for years, conservatives have dreamed of creating a countervailing media system that could challenge what they viewed as the liberal hegemony over American journalism and media. So they embarked upon this project, right? Starting first with think tanks, like the Heritage Foundation in 1974, I believe, and then a slew of other think tanks. So they built up this knowledge infrastructure, but then it's in the late 80s with Rush Limbaugh on talk radio and then Fox News that they create a media apparatus to amplify and to transmit, right, the populist narratives that the conservative movement had been using up until that point. And so now I want to shift gears to the key trends that happened in the late 80s and 90s, which is one of the most important moments, arguably, in American media history, is this shift from the network era where Americans really only had 4 or 5 channel options with the main big networks, NBC, CBS, ABC, right, was their only choices, to with the cable and satellite technologies, channel options explode. And by the time you get to the mid 90s, right, Americans have hundreds of channels to choose from. Right, so this radically changed the economics of the television industry. Instead of trying to appeal to a mainstream audience, right, and you don't want to offend anyone, the industry term was least objectionable programming. What happened is you started to develop television niche marketing strategies that appealed to audiences with tailored content, specific content. And the goal of this new marketing environment in the television industry was to appeal to people's identities, right? To elicit emotion. So it was less about getting the biggest audience and more about creating more intensive emotional relationships to your media brand. And so Fox News executives like Roger Ailes and Rupert Murdoch, kind of understanding where the TV trends were headed, they came up with this idea to use partisanship. I mean, an obviously giant reservoir of emotion, right, as a branding device, as a way to distinguish themselves in the crowded television market. So so that's the first trend, right? That's important. It's the proliferation of television niches. You had to have that to make something like a partisan conservative network possible. Otherwise, in another television age, it wouldn't have been practical. It wouldn't have been doable. The second trend that converges at precisely the same time is the uptick in political polarization in American society, the uptick of partisan identification in public life. And this started, of course, with the Nixon era, as I mentioned, but really took steam with Newt Gingrich's Republican Revolution in 1994, the 1994 midterms, when the Republican Party took back the House of Representatives and really stifled any liberal agenda that Bill Clinton, you could argue that he didn't really have a liberal agenda in the first place, but stifled liberal policy goals, right? And so that's the other thing. So if you mix this technological and industrial changes in American television, and you combine that with the political polarization, you know, the idea of creating a network based on conservative political identity seems kind of obvious, right? If you consider those two trends. Now, most scholars have mainly focused on those two trends, but my book really zeroes in on a third trend that I think is under-examined, which is the rise of tabloid media. So the 1990s wasn't just political polarization or technological innovations. It was a tabloid decade with the rise of, you know, Jerry Springer, you know, circus-like daytime talk shows like Ricky Lake and Jerry Springer, shock jocks like Howard Stern, and of course, Rush Limbaugh with talk radio. You know, you have the rise of reality television on Fox Broadcasting, which was owned, of course, by Rupert Murdoch. So you have this kind of trend toward more entertainment-driven media formats, and particularly in the journalism field. And there was a host of conservative TV projects that were trying to do what Fox did in terms of ideology and in terms of creating a niche based on political identity. But they, like their liberal journalism counterparts, decried infotainment. They decried the tabloid wave. And so Fox leaned into the tabloid wave, having, you know, Rupert Murdoch having his background in tabloid media, Roger Ailes, CEO of Fox News, having his background in daytime television. They understood how to incorporate these kind of lowbrow media formats and styles into political journalism, right? So it's the combination of all those factors that helps explain how they made partisan media compelling as television entertainment. And this is, you know, leads us to Donald Trump, right? He's really the logical conclusion of this synthesis between political populism and tabloid media. He you know, was a major figure in the tabloid paper scene in the 1980s in New York. He had one of the most successful reality television shows in the United States for 14 some years. And he was a full-blown character in the entertainment wrestling world, right? In their own narratives, you know, he was inducted in the World Entertainment Wrestling Hall of Fame, right? So he was definitely a tabloid creature, right? So in many ways, he was the logical conclusion of a populist kind of tabloid media trend that Fox News set in motion decades before his political candidacy. So I don't know what time, I forgot to start my clock. So how good am I on time? Hello?
Yeah.
Am I over time or how am I?
Yeah, you're on time. So
how much remaining time? I could end it there or I could keep going.
You can keep going for a minute.
Okay.
Are you listening to me? Okay.
Yeah. So another thing that Donald Trump represents that fits into my argument about the way in which conservatives reconfigure the meaning of social class in America is that he helps make sense of what seems paradoxical or contradictory, that this billionaire, or he actually wasn't a billionaire, but this, you know, millionaire real estate mogul, this rich man, right, from a rich family, is somehow the champion of the working class. But if you understand class in terms of taste, the way in which he appealed to lowbrow tastes in the media formats that he mastered, right, like reality television, tabloid media, it makes perfect sense, right? That he could be this voice of the little guy or the outsider, or the, as he used, the term he used was the forgotten Americans, right? So to really understand, and a lot of leftists, because they have more of a materialist or economic understanding of class, they're puzzled by why conservative populism works and why it's able to claim the voice of the people. But I think it's really instructive to consider the right-wing imagination of class as dealing with education level and taste. Now, these are not completely made up aspects of class. Class does in fact have a cultural aspect to it. It does, education level does matter. It's one of the biggest predictors in what marriage partners we select, right, in the United States, based on education level. So it's not like they created it out of whole cloth, right? But it's the way in which they narrowly define class in one way, and in effect obscure the economic realities of class, right? Which advances their broader neoliberal ideology, right? Their kind of free market, supply side economic agenda, deregulation, privatization, tax cuts on the wealthy, right? So it's not they create fake class, it's they have a strategically limited understanding of class that comes at the expense of a more economic understanding of class. And that's, for me, one of the key ways that we can explain this contradiction between the way the conservative movement advances a neoliberal economic agenda, and yet at the same time is successful at claiming the voice of the people. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Mr. Beck. Thank you very much. Before to listen, Mr. Melkuran, let me say that if now, are you listening to me? Yeah.
Are you talking to me or no? Okay.
No, I think it's my turn. Okay. Before listen, Mr. Melkuran, I was saying that maybe that if the spectators have some questions to do, they can write it in the chat of the YouTube, and after this first round, we will try to set the questions to the panelists. Thank you. Please, Mr. Melkuran, whenever you want.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for having me for this panel, and thank you, Reese, for making, preparing the ground for me. It was an amazing talk. Thank you very much, because I was planning to, first of all, your talk reminded me of 2016 when Trump was just elected and I was in New York and nobody was, the Democrats were in shock, and I was telling them, well, if Kardashians are the most important people in a country, it is only consistent that Trump is the president. So I think tabloids had to do something with it. That is why actually I'm going to start by defining populism. It's not going to be an academic definition, certainly not, but I think it's a convenient definition and quite user-friendly when we're talking about populism. I think populism is organizing and mobilizing the banality and the ignorance of the masses to manipulate them into making choices against their own interests and against the good of humanity. And if we define populism like this, we can see that there are two kinds of oppositions against right-wing populism. One is, and most people are in this category in terms of opposition, they are the ones who think that right-wing populism is a passing by fancy and the center will hold. And the second group, which actually I belong to, say that this right-wing populism is the inborn pathology of neoliberalism. When right-wing populism hit the stage of global politics with such fanfare, the state of the media in every country was more or less the same, which is interesting because some of these countries were known to be the mature and strong democracies, whereas the others were considered as crazy countries that anything can happen one of them being Turkey. State of the media when right-wing populism hit the global stage was very interesting. I think we can look at this in two aspects. The media had already lost its moral high ground, and it had lost its political ground. Moral high ground was something that was coming from outside, from social media. I don't know if you remember, but when before social media was used as a tool to manipulate the masses for the benefit of right-wing populism, it was actually used by the progressive forces, both in several places such as Tahrir, in Tunis, in Turkey as well. But then, and meanwhile, there was an interesting shift in perception of media. Somehow, especially in Tahrir, and I was there following the demonstrations, people were more trusting in those people with nicknames on Twitter than New York Times or CNN International. They were choosing human beings over logos that millions of dollars were invested in. That was an interesting shift in terms of moral high ground of media, trustworthiness of media. And conventional media was already struggling with this. But the loss of political high ground, or political ground rather, happened way back in 1980s when neoliberal politics were unleashed all over the world. In Turkey, it happened through a military coup. It was a very brutal coup, but in other countries, it happened by rather peacefully, I would say. And it started with Margaret Thatcher handbagging a nation, and on the other side of the Atlantic, there was Ronald Reagan, and they were both echoing the same motto, there is no alternative. So politics became something dirty and unnecessary. It was degraded, it was diminished, politics was diminished into administration, and somebody was going to take care of that for us. So politics in general became unappealing to the masses. And meanwhile, the media has cut its ties with politics and political parties, especially on the left. And there was a shift of understanding, defining the truth as well, and the facts. Because I was a journalist then in 1990s, and I saw it happening on daily basis. There was this myth of objectivity, which actually was neutrality. We were supposed to be objective, and we were supposed to be extremely balanced. But then when the forces in a society are not equal, and the privileged always gets the big part of the power, being objective in that sense, being balanced in the sense meant that naturally you fall with the privileged and the powerful. So this mixing objectivity and neutrality happened in Turkey before my eyes, but in other countries, now I know that it was already happening after 1980s. So this is important because being balanced became a obsession for media, and that is why it was so easy for the media, for the journalists, to fall into the trap of respect narrative when right-wing populists came into political stage asking for respect. As Rees put it very well, this new understanding of class is based on taste, and in the United States it's based on taste maybe, but in other countries it's based on different things. As far as I see, right-wing populism leak into political scene, mainstream political scene, by using the moral and political cracks of a country, the weak links in moral and political sphere. So in Turkey, for instance, they were asking for respect, as they did in several other countries. And when you don't respect them, you were blamed of being the elite, the oppressive elite, rather. So when they fashioned themselves as the underdog in the beginning, when they were creeping into the political power, it was easy for the journalists to fall into the trap of, let's show them respect, let's provide them with a say, and let's give them a stage to represent themselves. And the elusive narrative of right-wing populism leaked into the mainstream media and mainstream politics. And then on, it became, of course, the story changes and it becomes really dangerous. It's no more this underdog asking for respect, but rather when you don't respect it, you are done. You are no longer, no longer can perform your job as a journalist. This is a phenomenon that actually turns the agora of political communication to an arena. And while right-wing populist movements creep into the political stage, they use this arena setup quite effectively. And then you find yourself as an opposing journalist, and any opposing journalist would, I think, agree with this, not having a political discussion, but rather you're having a cage fight with the apparatchiks or the spin doctors of right-wing populist movement. Between 2016 and 2019, as Adam kindly mentioned, I wrote the book, How to Lose a Country, 7 Steps from Democracy to Dictatorship. And what I did was gathering the experience in Turkey, and then putting on top of it the similarities in other countries. These countries were completely different from each other, obviously, but the patterns of right-wing populism rising to the power was exactly the same. And one of those patterns was disrupting the rationale and terrorizing the political language. And of course, this, especially this step from democracy to dictatorship, is very much related to media and journalism. What they do, right-wing populists do in every country, is the same thing. They show an ostentatious offensiveness against the media. And they are putting them in the target. They are branding them as the spoiled rascals or oppressive elite in United States United States context. And they are promoting hatred of media. The interesting part of this story is how media reacts to it. And I've seen it happening exactly the same way in every country. First, they make fun of the situation. They mock the leader. They mock the ignorance of the supporters. And then they are failing to protect themselves when there was, when it's time. And of course, during 1980s, when neoliberal politics were unleashed and when they affected the media, as well as in Turkey, in Turkey and as well as other countries, something happened to media itself as well, regardless of their political stance. We lost the unions. We lost our political stance in terms of protecting journalism. And when we are, put in the target, when there is this ostentatious offensiveness from right-wing populism, I think we failed to protect ourselves as an institution, as one of the pillars of democracy. What else? Before beginning this panel, Jordi was telling something about Hungary and how it is devastating to see the details of what's happening, to see the pettiness of human beings, of individuals in this process of corruption. Right-wing populism is not only a political matter, but it's also a moral matter, and it corrupts people. And it is exhausting to watch this happening, because it doesn't happen to some other people that you don't know, that you belong to another political camp. It belongs to your own circle as well. You see the people closest to you getting influenced by it, or showing understanding to this new form of fascism, and kind of, you know, going with the flow and so on. So what happens to journalism is not only affects the journalist as an institution, it's not only an institutional corruption, but also the individuals themselves, the journalists themselves, become really battered in the process. And I think we're going to talk about how to overcome this malaise of our times in the second round. But what I want to tell now is that in Turkey, it's not that we didn't do enough. It is just we didn't do it early enough. Because we thought it wouldn't happen here. It is, maybe it might sound funny for those people who follow Turkey now, that we felt that, because we are, you know, used to seeing it in the United States or Britain when people say that, oh, it cannot happen here. But actually, we felt the same thing when right-wing populism started showing up in the political stage. In the, you know, while between 2016 and 2019, I looked at countries and I saw that every country has its own moral blind spot, so to speak. In Turkey, we always thought that these things would happen to Arab countries, not in Turkey, just like Britain or United States. So I hope we are going to talk about these blind spots in the second round together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ece. Very interesting, scary, but very interesting. Now, Jordi, it's your turn.
Thanks, bona tarda. Good evening, everyone. Recep described how the media environment created the space for the rise to power of a national populist. And in a way, I will describe how a national populist, once in power, recreated the media space of his country, Hungary, to cement his grip on power. And Ece Temelkuran, at the beginning of her speech, is explaining how the transformative power of a right-wing populism that's tightly connected to neoliberalism and to a Sikh economic system. And I will illustrate with Hungary a version of how a Sikh triangulation between authoritarian political power, economic power, and the fourth power operates. Let me first, Hungary is an illiberal democracy. I don't say it, take it from Viktor Orbán, the prime minister. He described his way of exercising power as an illiberal democracy in July 2014. For him, liberal democracies are obstacles to the success of nations, whereas illiberal democracies, and he was quoting China, Singapore, Russia, Turkey, are the winners. And what is this Hungarian version of an illiberal democracy? It's first of all a version where effective government is not hindered by separation of powers or for human rights. There's no limits to the rule of the one who has the majority of votes and extreme centralization of power. It's secondly an uneven playing field. There's been changes to the constitution, to the electoral system, limits to free speech and debate, pressure on civil society, tight control of education. So it's no longer a level playing field in democracy. A third characteristic is it's a country that's politically controlled, with a politically controlled economy, with very strong national players who are friends of power. It's a chronic capitalism, or as former Minister Balint Magyar called it, a mafia state. Fourth characteristic is the prevalence of national sovereignty and irredentism, the idea of Hungarians abroad. The fifth is the populist tactics, and we've heard some of it, in particular from Asia: fear-mongering, extreme polarization, anti-pluralistic vision of society. And the last one is the direct engagement with activating and shaping public opinion from the government. And the public sphere serves mostly to legitimate the party in power. A government in constant campaign mode, spending large sums on billboards, on media campaigns, national consultations and referendums, really for propaganda purposes. And what does an illiberal country like this, what kind of media policy does it have? Well, there's kind of three pillars of this illiberal media policy. as described by Gabor Polyak a few years ago, and a fourth one, which is new. It's only it's less than 2 years old, or just 2 years old. So the first three pillars are, first of all, undermining the independence of the organizations that are responsible for overseeing private and public media, right? So in Hungary, this meant a packet of media laws that came in 2010, which is in the same year where Orbán was elected in May. So a very quick action on media. And this meant the change in the composition of the Hungarian Media Council, which has the regulatory and oversight functions, and therefore regulates the entry, expansion, acquisitions, terrestrial and radio frequencies. And once you have established control of this organ, and also control of public media, and all public media assets have been centralized under a media service support and asset management fund, and a public service foundation, again, fully controlled by government, right? So you have that the regulatory space for private is controlled by the government, and public media basically has become a total tool of the government, very active in shaping and taming public opinion, and even in spreading misinformation, including, by the way, Russia propaganda. Now, the second pillar of this media policy is market manipulation and soft censorship. Soft censorship is a concept. Joel Simon of the Committee to Protect Journalism basically describes this as a way to manage critical expression through A, national security prosecutions, B, punitive tax audits, 3, manipulation of government advertising, and 4th, what sound like reasonable content restrictions on, say, graphic violence or hate speech or fake news abused, right? So in this space of market manipulation, this the way this operated is in Hungary is a number of actions to allow oligarchs with money, by giving them, for example, radio frequencies or helping their purchases of newspapers, allowing these oligarchs around power with money to use money that they've used in other parts of the economy to acquire parts of the media market. And if you look at the big names like 2-3 years ago in the Hungarian market, you'd find only Orbán friends, basically, or almost only. So the government's film commissioner, Andrei Vajan, one of his direct advisors, Arpad Havoni, the former right hand of his enemy, media tycoon, was Gabor Liszkai, a personal friend, Loring Mészáros, and even the son of the Bank of Hungary central governor, who is one of Orbán's closest closest political allies. So you have all these oligarchs using the money they make in other parts of the economy, thanks to their closeness to government, to buy media outlets. And then you have government advertising, which is about a third or even more of the whole advertising market, and it's vital to the survival of many outlets as an indicator. It's also not only vital to the outlets, but also an indicator to every other private advertiser of where their money should go if they want to please the government, right? And also a good place of disciplining advertising agencies. So you've controlled the income, you've controlled the market regulators, and then the third sort of a big tool of this policy is the manipulation of the information environment. Very punitive media laws. So even the threat of an investigation is chilling because it can really cripple the operation of a media outlet. Very extensive administrative powers by the media authority. Very precarious situation of journalists and very dependent media outlets all of which encourage self-censorship. And then, of course, there's a very unequal treatment of journalists. So those that come from outlets that are critical, they don't get a voice, they don't get to ask questions in press conferences. Staff of public education and healthcare cannot discuss with any media. So they really cannot even do their job, right? Now, all of this operates between 2010 and 2018. And in 2018 comes the final sort of piece in this, which is that in November 2018, all these oligarchs that had been building and buying these media empires, thanks to their connection to government, they became very generous. And they decided to donate their entire media portfolios to a newly created Central European Press and Media Foundation, a huge foundation that would be worth around 90 million euro, with 500 of the country's media outlets, including cable news channels, radio stations, internet news portals, newspapers, magazines, everything under one foundation. That's not all of the Hungarian media scene, but almost all of the pro-government, which is a huge majority, right? This is led by a close ally of Orbán, and Orbán himself then signed a decree. The prime minister signed a decree exempting this mega merger from any regulatory oversight, right? And just to give you an example of what this kind of media scene looks like, the day before 2019 European Parliament elections, all of the 16 regional newspapers of this huge foundation, all of them had exactly the same front page, and it was a pro-Orbán message, so that people would go and vote for Fidesz in the European Parliament elections. So the result of this media policy is that pro-government media have unlimited access to market sources, so to advertising and others, and to information, and their expansion has been supported by the decision of the Media Authority. And then once they had occupied all the space, they were all centralized in one place, and then the government party uses the established media system to exercise tight control of the public discourse. In Hungary, Ege Temelkuran was talking about governments that promote hatred of the media and depict them as the elite. This is totally the case in Hungary. Orbán, for example, refused to answer a critical question of an outlet or a television because he called the television station fake news, a bit like Donald Trump, right? And there's even a news program on a pro-government TV station that there is a news program called Debunking Fake News, and all they do is take articles from independent media and depict them as lies without giving this, by the way, this independent media any opportunity to defend themselves. So this is how the Hungarian government has been totally transforming the media scene. And before I end, I would like to talk about another phenomenon which we should pay attention to, which is how meddling through media is not only something that happens in Hungary, because these friends of Orbán, these tycoons, before they became so generous and decided to donate all of their assets, all of their media assets to this big foundation, had gone shopping, and they had gone shopping in the neighborhood of Hungary. Of course, in the countries where there's Hungarian-speaking minorities, right, where there's a huge penetration from the state, but also in countries where there's political allies of Viktor Orbán, in particular two countries, Slovenia and North Macedonia, where the two allies, one in North Macedonia had been prime minister and one in Slovenia is now the prime minister. And in both countries, we see in 2017 Hungarian companies starting to buy media outlets, including web portals, TV stations, and those Budapest-based companies, some of them created the day before the buying all this media, were controlled by the media oligarchs, former employees of Hungarian public television and others, right? Those purchases were often done in coordination with the people around the right-wing leader and admirer of Orbán, Janez Janša in Slovenia, and the people around Nikola Gruevski, the right-wing nationalist leader in Macedonia. It's interesting to hear that some people in those media and also in Hungary, they justify that Hungarian companies are in those media markets for the money. And if you look at the published economic results, they seem to prove it because they are making a profit. However, if we look a bit closer at the advertisers, we see that, for example, in Northern Macedonia, some of the major advertisers in Hungarian-owned media outlets, they were small companies like Oliveri, which is an olive oil company, Boniard, a home decorations company, Skin Delights, which is a cosmetics company. Why am I mentioning these companies? Well, the interesting thing about this is that none of these companies sell anything in the Northern Macedonian shops. So they are Hungarian companies just going and advertising in Northern Macedonian media only to sustain this really toxic relationship between economic power, political power, and media power. And that triangle between the three, where media becomes totally subordinate and where political power through economic power then takes control of the media, is a really worrying, I think it's a really toxic and worrying triangle, because the state of media funding and media business models everywhere, absolutely everywhere in the world, is really dire. There is no country in the world with a healthy media business. That means that every country in the world is very susceptible to this kind of manipulation. I'm going to leave it here and then hopefully discuss more in the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jordi. Very interesting and even more scary than what Ege told us before. This last round was we thought that could be interesting for the propositions and some kind of advices. I know that it's very difficult to make an advice to another country and to a different reality, but maybe you could give us some advices, not only to the people, to the spectators, but also to the press, to the Catalan and Spanish press that have to deal with these phenomena. And like for us, we don't have a very huge experience, or not your experience. And as well in this turn, in this round, we have some questions, and I ask you to answer the questions in the same intervention, please. For you, Mr. Peck, for you, Rhys, there are two questions. First is, in your opinion, what's the main difference of more recent outlets like Newsmax compared to now well-established Fox? And the second question is, now that Trump lost his direct connection with the supporters on Twitter, how do you see the political economy of social media evolving? Do you think those alternative media like Parler will represent a real competition to mainstream social media? So please, Rhys, I ask you to answer the three questions in 3 or 4 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, those are hard questions, and they're kind of outside my realm of expertise to a degree. So I studied Fox for 10 years, but I'm currently studying left-wing media on YouTube. So I haven't paid as much attention to Newsmax and AON to actually do an in-depth analysis of their content the way I did with Fox News. So the question is how are they different? I mean, just from, following journalism and coverage of AON and this tension between Fox and these new upstarts, right, that are seeking to take Fox's audience share, which indications that they are eating into Fox recently, specifically because, Fox, I had to explain it. Part of media, there's a dopamine element to media. There's joy. You want to watch your political opponents embarrassed. There's joy in the political win. And so whenever there are moments in American cable news where one side loses, their ratings drop because people don't have the spirit to watch the news. They want good news. They want their partisan representatives to tell them everything is great. And for weeks and weeks and weeks, Fox was feeding its audience this lie that Trump was going to win any day now. New evidence is going to appear. They're going to win the court case. Right. And then when it hit a breaking point where even its most pro-Trump opinion hosts had to tell the reality. They had to say he's not going to win. Right. And so those viewers don't want to hear that. Right. Because that doesn't give them that good feeling anymore. It creates cognitive dissonance between their own sense of reality and the actual reality. And so I think AON and Newsmax are willing to do what Fox News, like they're still willing to kind of promote this fantasy land, right? And it helps create, continue this kind of dopamine, this good feeling of watching the news. But I don't know how, I don't know how successful that's going to be. It doesn't seem like a long-term strategy. And again, it's very difficult to break into the American television dial. It takes enormous amounts of capital, enormous amounts of elite connections that Jordi talked about in the United States. There's a similar triangulation that Rupert Murdoch was very masterful at exploiting. And Newsmax and AON, you know, they're not as entrenched in that triangulation of power, economic power, political power, and media power as Fox News. Not only that, you know, just from a marketing perspective, brand loyalties are very hard to break. Once a brand loyalty is forged, all marketers know this, advertisers know this. Once a brand loyalty is forged, it's very difficult to break. I mean, now, but you do have this enormous historical shift with Trump's law. So in that window, it is possible to capture audience shares because it creates such a moment of cognitive dissonance. But I'm not convinced that they'll overtake Fox, and I don't know their strategy of just being diehard Trump loyalists. There is a market for that, but I don't think it's big enough. There's more of a mainstream Republican that kind of accepts the loss. That's just your grandma and grandpa, not storming the Capitol, but just regular Republicans that they want news from a conservative point of view, but they don't want to be given utter fantasy, right? And so I'm not sure, but I have to, again, plead a little bit of ignorance. I haven't been following their content, their actual content. And so I'm weary about making bold claims about AON and Newsmax. The social media, that's probably a long-winded response. Should I pass it on to colleagues, or should I try to engage that second question?
Yeah, sure. I have also a question for you, AJ. Yeah. The question is, mocking journalists and authoring of objectivity as elite are also traits we see among left-wing populists. Do you see an intersection where extremes may touch when it comes to populist discourse between left and right populism?
You know, I've been going around the world answering this question, and whenever I'm asked this question, I am very aware of the place where I am asked that question. Because if it's in Britain, and when somebody asks about left-wing populism, I feel like, okay, now you are trying to equalize fascism with some Latin American leader who has no influence in the world. When I'm asked this question in Mexico, it's a bit different. So if we are asked this question in Catalan context, or in European context rather, I would say, let's not get into left-wing populism now. Let's speak about neo-fascism that we are dealing with. It is choking us on every level, morally, politically, economically, and psychologically as well. So let's keep on there. Like, let's keep our focus on right-wing populism now. I see an ideological background when somebody asks about left-wing populism, when there is no left-wing populism that we can put our finger on as a threat to our understanding of democracy, and and on global level. But I wanted to say something about, because Adam, you said 2 times scary after I talked and after Jordi talked. This is not scary. We shouldn't be scared. Or rather, I'd put it like this. We are living in an age of fear. So it's better that we befriend this fear, both the virus and fascism. I think one of the things that I keep seeing this everywhere, we lost our faith in humankind, and we lost our faith in a better world in general. We are constantly talking about the horrible things that, like, we are doing now, and it kind of weakens our faith in ourselves. This is going to be all right. We can do it better. I think we have to keep on saying this because it's already very tiring to be subjected to or to witness what's going on in the world. I can imagine Reese, watching Fox News for 10 years. It is like, probably you have post-traumatic stress disorder. And it is not only you, it's all of us. We are feeling like, am I mad? The entire world, or the entire world gone mad? What's happening? And ironically, this am I mad or rest of the humanity is mad question is asked by an author who lived under the under Stalin's regime. It's a very famous quote. So we are in that situation now. We are trying to save the world, save humanity, and save our understanding of truth. So I think left-wing populism is just, it's like a sideshow at the moment. The main focus must be right-wing populism.
All right, thank you. Thank you for your words of hope that are very good for us now. Maybe you, Riz, want to finish your speech about the social media or not?
I forgot the question. It was about Trump getting kicked off of Twitter, and then the emergence of Parler as an alternative to Facebook.
Yeah.
We all have to decide on a causal force, right? Now, a simplistic analysis would just have a singular causal force, like it's just technology or it's just politics, and no one in this panel has that, analysis. We all have expressed a multi-field analysis, a multi-causal analysis of what's going on, right? But we lean in different directions, right? So I really focus on still the power of the messaging, the actual style, the actual rhetoric, right? I still believe that that's important, while also acknowledging the political economic forces, the technological forces, the political movements, et cetera. But there is this thing about regulation that, it shows its power, right? The actual regulatory policies that Jordi talked about a little bit, this regulatory capture, right, that's happened in Hungary. It is showing the power, right, when they decide, these tech companies decide to kick Trump off Twitter, right? I'm not big on, that's not my focus. I don't focus on regulation, but it's undeniable. This is a case where they shut down Parler, right? And it's affecting, so the market for conservative media is huge and it's very powerful, but that power has limitations. If the regulatory state is not, and these tech companies are not, they can choose to not feed that market, right? I don't know how I feel about that necessarily, but I think that it's very telling. It's a very interesting case study that I haven't wrapped my head around yet, but I do think it shows what type of power the tech companies can have if they choose to use it. Because Trump, I've never felt this feeling of a non-Trump voice in my brain in the last 5 years like I have in the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks, because he's off Twitter. Right. And so, I don't know. But again, it goes back to this brand loyalty thing. It's very difficult to break conservatives who do very well on Facebook, whose content tends to outperform liberal content on Facebook because of its sensational nature. I feel like my conservative aunts and uncles are not going to stop using Facebook. Right. And so, again, it's this hardcore MAGA base that will do that. But is that a big enough market? Is that a big enough market to have a successful long-term financial model? I don't know.
All right. Thank you, Riz. And finally, Jordi, do you think that you can take some lessons from Hungary that can be useful here in Catalonia and Spain? Just to end.
Yeah, I don't know if it's particularly for Catalonia and Spain, but I think it's in general. I think I agree with AJ that perhaps sometimes populism is a bit of a red herring. I think we should, populism is dangerous, but to some extent it can be part of democracy. It can fit inside the democracy, and certainly we shouldn't worry about conservatism per se, even if we don't like it. I don't particularly like conservatism. But we must worry about naked, pure authoritarianism. And the problems, often is not basically what they claim and what they say, but what they do. I know speech is action. I know some of the things that they say are dangerous, but we cannot allow them to use speech as a smoke curtain while they transform the media system or any other part of our democracy. We spend so much time talking about what national populists say, and rather than focusing on what they actually do. And this is really dangerous, because what I've described about Hungary, people don't even know. They don't know that all these oligarchs all of a sudden donated all of their media empires to a foundation that's controlled by the state, which is unbelievable. We need to be really vigilant on respect for media from power. Listen, if it looks rotten and smells rotten, it probably is rotten, right? If a government or a politician before she or he gets into government, you know, is aggressive against media, if a party is not allowing non-sympathetic media into their events, if they are threatening them, if there's a constant, you know, exclusion, rejection of questions, you know, you need to take the conclusions. You need to look at other countries, at the Hungarian, at the Polish, at the Turkish experience, and elsewhere, and not just say, oh, you know, this, you know, we have no right to be here, and all this. I think that those to me are two important lessons, and two more important lessons is work on your business models, because you may have the best investigative outlet in the world, the most independent journalism, and all this, but every media outlet is really weak on that, on this. And you know, if you depend on two advertisers who can easily be intimidated, it's so easy to shut you down. So I think everywhere working on this is crucial. And the last thing, beware of meddling in media markets from abroad, whether this meddling comes in the form of, you know, Rupert Murdoch or Russia, or you know, or the Hungarians going to Slovenia. Follow the money and investigate. Know what you have in front. Understand who is entering these media markets and with which intentions. I think I don't want to minimize. You know, we have to be super critical about how these, you know, how Donald Trump, how other people are perverting language, how they're transforming public speech, and all this. But I also think, because precisely many of us, either journalists or people like me in social science or with social science background, we think this is so important, how people talk about this. Oh, look at the outrageous thing he said, this really sexist thing he just said, or this really horrible racist thing. And it's all about what they say, but it's what they do that is really transformative. So this deeper analysis of what's going on in the media space also, it's very important. We're too mesmerized by how clever they are using media and all this. And some of the things they are doing, they are not very clever. They're pure naked power politics, you know, economic power and political power and state power politics. And sometimes all of this is obscured by all this fanfare and all this flamboyance and all this kind of, you know, all this media image. It's all about image. You know, it's not all about image. It's about power. And it's about transforming the structures of democratic governance. And so that's perhaps my advice is, you know, are we paying enough attention to this whether these national populist authoritarians, which is the real danger, that they're national populists is unpleasant and somewhat dangerous, but they are authoritarian is the real thing. I mean, you know, Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, yes, he's a national populist, but basically he's a dictator. So, you know, let's call a spade, because otherwise we're obscuring a little bit things by just staying too much at the level of discourse and other things. So that would be my, I don't know if it's advice or kind of cry.
Thank you, Jordi. Just to end the debate, I think Grace have something to say.
Yeah, I mean, I want to push back a little bit, only to the extent that, you know, Jordi, I believe you said at the beginning of your talk, you said it matters like what weight you put into what factor, whether it's the behind the scenes power politics versus the surface level discourse, right? Depends on the stage of the political formation and media formation's rise. I was going to ask you, like, I'm interested in the kind of prequel to Orbán, like how did they rise to power? That's the story I tell, right? And that's different when you're analyzing that versus their current moment where they have all this immense power and they have this authoritarian kind of rule, right? But part of the story of how they arrived at that power base was by appealing to the popular masses through style, right? So part of the story of the left is its inability to create content that resonates with large swaths of the working class. They build that audience and then they wield that as a form of power later, right? That's what the right did. Rupert Murdoch, before he did anything, he had to make compelling content. He couldn't just will himself with power connections in the American market, right? He had to first establish an appealing product. And to do that, he was a student of mass taste, right? So I think the left also needs to think about this problem that they're alienating, right, working class viewers in a lot of media markets. They tend to put a kind of educated professional viewer at the center of their imagination when they're creating their content. And it's had dire consequences for them, right? And it reinforces these alignments where we associate the right wing with the working class. Well, it's partly because of the left's inability to kind of understand popular culture and connect it to politics. I think it's a different story that you're speaking of once they've arrived at power, right? And then I 100% agree with you that you shift, right, your analysis. But if we're talking about the left, what the left needs to do, then I think it's instructive to look at the right's rise. What was the secret to their rise, right? And part of it was they were more savvy at understanding the culture, right? And they were able to create a news product that was more compelling. A lot of Americans, in my context, didn't want this middle brow, detached, emotionless, right, professional style that dominated American news from the 40s to the 80s. They wanted something different, and Murdoch was able to capture that. Now we're in the 2020s, we associate that style with the right, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So I think that the left needs to think about a little more deeply about the kind of news and the way they present the news and who it appeals to and who it alienates, maybe a little more. But I think it depends on the stage of like the analysis.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we are at the end of the debate. We wanted to find common points between the three cases, and I think we get it. So we are happy with it, and we are. I think with the debate and your speeches have been really interesting. Just remember that we will make a resume in English, Catalan, and Spanish, and it will be published in the webpage of revistaideas.cat, so anyone can watch it and read it. So that's all. Thank you very much again. Bona nit a tothom. Thank you. Bye.
All right. Thanks.